Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the latest in a series of public events by the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. I am Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University, and we are proud to host the Hayden Center. Tonight, we have over 300 persons signed up on Zoom from all over the United States and internationally, and we are live on our YouTube channel as well. Participants specifically are from 31 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico, as well as 14 countries and 4 continents, and also from 22 colleges and universities throughout the United States and internationally. And of course, we have a good many students here from George Mason University. The Michael Hayden Center, of course, honors its founder, General Michael Hayden. The Hayden Center is part of a larger security studies emphasis in the Schar School of Policy and Government. Our International Security Studies Master's Degree program has been a top 10 ranked nationally program for 4 years running in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And we are fortunate to have many leading scholars and practitioner teachers in our International Security Studies Master's Degree program. Among our practitioner faculty members are General Hayden himself, who has been with the Schar School now for 12 years, and Michael Morell, who will be co-teaching a class for us actually in the spring semester, along with Professor Ellen Lapson, the director of our Security Studies degree program, and David Priest, the publisher and COO of Lawfare, and Ronald Marks, who has been churning out some really fine columns on intelligence and security issues lately, and several others as well. Now, for interested prospective students, we have a generous gift from the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation supporting scholarships in the Schar School for students who are in security studies fields. Now, before the executive director of the Hayden Center and former director of the White House Situation Room, Larry Pfeiffer, introduces tonight's program, I welcome brief remarks from General Hayden. General?
Thank you again. I'm really looking forward to this. This is going to be really, really interesting. I want to say something about everybody there. I think it's going to be well worth our time, okay? Larry, your turn now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. Really appreciate it. As Mark has mentioned, the Hayden Center is part of the Schar School of Policy and Government. We've been here for a few years now, and we were founded by General Hayden as an effort to put a spotlight on intelligence and the role it plays in supporting policymakers. We do that largely through events like the one you're in tonight, where we bring prominent experts from academia, from government, from outside government to come and talk about these topics. Our tonight's event is also being streamed on YouTube, and it's being recorded. Later in the event, we will have time for questions from the audience. We would ask that you use the Q&A tool as part of Zoom to pose your question. Do not use the chat to pose your question. Your question may not get passed to the moderator if it's only in the chat. Keep your question brief, make it a question. If you'd like to be anonymous, there is a little box in the Q&A tool. You click anonymous to hide your identity. But if you're proud of your name and affiliation, please include that as well. You can find all of our Hayden Center events on YouTube. You can follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So we welcome you to do that if you haven't already done so. Tonight, we're going to examine what many call the greatest challenge to U.S. national security this century. General Hayden, when he met with Bill Burns as he was getting ready to be confirmed as the CIA director, he was asked by the incoming director what are the great challenges he needs to worry about. And General Hayden told him the first thing you need to worry about is China. The second thing you need to worry about is China. And I think the third thing you need to worry about is China. So it only makes sense that we here at the Hayden Center are going to have an event that discusses China tonight. Some argue that conflict with China is inevitable. Others argue that a Cold War stance like we had against the Soviet Union is most appropriate. Some call for peaceful coexistence or even robust engagement. Whatever you think, we need to understand better just who China is and what it represents, and we're going to do that tonight with this great panel. Moderating the discussion tonight will be Michael Morell, as he's done several times in the past. He's a former deputy director and twice acting director of CIA. His 30 plus years in the intel community includes the distinction of being the only person with President Bush on 9/11 and President Obama when Osama bin Laden was taken down. He is a CBS News contributor on national security and intelligence, and he features prominently on their podcast, Intelligence Matters, which has hosted or replayed the audio from several of our events in the past. He serves as a senior fellow at the Hayden Center and a distinguished visiting professor at the Schar School. Our panel members, our experts that we're bringing you tonight, include Ketian Zhang. She is an assistant professor of international security here at the Schar School with a regional focus on China and East Asia. She has a book project called Calculating Bully, explaining Chinese coercion. This is going to build off of a peer-reviewed article that appeared in summer of 2019's edition of International Security called Cautious Bully, Reputation, Resolve, and Beijing's Use of Coercion in the South China Sea. If you've not read it, I commend it to you all. Secondly, we have Hal Brands. Hal Brands is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, just up the road. He's an author of several books on grand strategy, foreign policy, statecraft. He has a book coming up in January that is called The Twilight Struggle, What the Cold War Teaches Us About Great Power Rivalry. And I think some of the work he did on that book is going to inform our discussion tonight. Other things he's done is included being a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning back in 2015 and 16, and an advisor to other defense and intel organizations through the years. Our last panelist, but absolutely not least, I'm quite honored to have him join us today, is Professor Graham Allison. Professor Allison is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he has taught for the last 5 decades. He's the founding dean of the esteemed Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government. He served as the director until 2017 of its Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He is the author of innumerable articles and books on national security, nuclear weapons, Russia, China, terrorism, and decision-making. His most recent book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap?, was an international bestseller and is quite influential in today's debate among the policy community about the China-U.S. relationship. His first book, Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, has been essential reading for anybody interested in national security, and it revolutionized the way we examine decision-making in times of crisis. He served as an Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration and as a special advisor to the Secretary in the Reagan administration. He's been a member of the Defense Science Board for most of the past 35 years. I don't think we could bring together a more unique and knowledgeable set of panelists for this discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael and the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry. Let me add my own welcome to Ketian, Graham, and Hal. All three of you have thought about and written extensively on China, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. The three of you know, the audience doesn't know, but the three of you know that I want to ask 5 basic but very strategic questions, see where we get similar views and see where we get differences of opinion. We will rotate who gets to go first as we go through the questions. For the first 3 questions, one of our panelists will take the lead with the other 2 commenting with a bit more time for the person in the lead. And for the last 2 questions, everyone will get equal time. So I want to kick it off here with the first question, which is, what are China's ambitions in the world, and what is the source of those ambitions? In other words, what does China want the world order to look like, and what is behind that desire? Graham, we're going to start with you with this one.
So thank you, Michael. And let me say thank you to the other members of the panel, and especially to Mike Hayden. What a great honor to be part of the whole discussion. So your question about China's ambitions, I would say could hardly be clearer. In one line, what Xi's China wants is to make China great again. Now that banner he unfurled when he became president almost 5 years before Trump had his analog about making America great again. So from a Chinese perspective, for Xi and his team, they imagine China in the 21st century becoming as powerful and influential as America was in the 20th century. Indeed, if the 20th century was an American century, as we often describe it, they imagine the 21st century as China's century. What's the source of this ambition? I would say three: geopolitical, cultural, and ideological. The most powerful is geopolitical. They bear the scars of what they call the century of humiliation, and they're determined that China should be so powerful that never again, and they say never again, could it be humiliated, imperialized, exploited the way it was by Westerners with technology in the previous centuries. Secondly, culturally, China in Mandarin means center of the universe, between heaven and earth. So Chinese culturally and historically imagine China as the sun around which all other planets, all other countries revolve. So the proposition that China should be restored to, quote, its rightful place at the center of the universe resonates for Chinese. Thirdly, ideologically, they want to show that a party-led autocracy practicing what she calls socialism with Chinese characteristics can govern more successfully than Western models. So in sum, Xi is serious about making China great again. He's on that path at a very rapid upward slope. And he believes that, as he says, China is inexorably rising and the US irreversibly declining. Is that 4 minutes?
That's
less.
That is less than 4 minutes. That's excellent, Graham. Ketian, can you comment?
Sure. And first off, it's really an honor to be part of this conversation. I'll be just very brief. And I agree with Graham that obviously China has ambitions that's more external, including sort of having the status as a rising power, as well as exerting influence around the globe. But I also wanted to scale back sort of the conversation a little bit to sort of emphasize that a lot of China's core concerns are still relatively internal, as well as be close to its sort of a region, especially in regard to East Asia and Southeast Asia. So China does want a stable external environment for its economic growth, as well as its sovereignty, including Taiwan and Tibet being its core interests. So I would say its ambitions are there, but it's relatively limited. And the sort of source behind the ambition, or the sources for China's concerns, I would say, is really internal. That is the regime security of the Chinese Communist Party. And I believe that sort of a rational calculation is at the core of the Chinese Communist Party's decision making.
Hal.
I agree with much of what my co-panelists have said. The way I think about it is that you can conceive of China's interests or goals making up 4 concentric circles of progressively greater ambition as you move outward. And at the center is preserving the rule and the political monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party, which is really at the center of everything the regime does. But that doesn't mean it has limited geopolitical goals. Its geopolitical goals are quite expansive. I think the second concentric circle might be thought of as making China whole again, basically reclaiming or claiming pieces of China that Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials argue are integral parts of China, whether that's Taiwan or the 9-dash line of the South China Sea or other things, but that actually have pretty disruptive regional implications. And that leads to the third concentric circle, which has sometimes been referred to as Asia for Asians. And so basically a regional sphere of influence in which China is dominant because the United States has been kicked to the margins. And then I think the fourth circle is probably the most contentious one. And this may go to what Graham was saying about make China great again. I think at the very least, it's clear that the Chinese Communist Party is aiming to give China global parity with the United States by 2035 or 2050 or whatever the timeline is. And perhaps even global primacy, perhaps even becoming the most powerful country in the world, which, as our panelists have noted, is sort of the historical norm at which China sees itself occupying. It's only in the past 150 years that China has really been a second or a third tier power in the world.
Great. Second question. Does China have a well-developed strategy for achieving its ambition? And if so, what is it? And importantly, is Xi Jinping's approach to domestic politics and the greater grip on power that he is exhibiting and the reversal of economic reforms, is that putting this strategy, this ambition at any risk? Ketian, let's start with you.
Sure. So I will first sort of reiterate how I read China's sort of, I think you're asking China's sort of overall grand strategy in terms of means and ends, and whether the current strategy in terms of means is actually successful in the long term or not. So the first part of the question, I think I'll sort of characterize China's main goals as, for example, ensuring region security, economic growth, and sovereignty. And in order to achieve these goals, I think China is sort of using a carrots and sticks strategy in combination. By carrots, I really mean a combination of the use of, say, economic statecraft with, I think, the BRI or Belt and Road Initiative being one example of it, as well as diplomatic sort of statecraft. But I think as of now, we're increasingly seeing China using those sticks as well, including coercive measures. I think in particular, the use of economic coercion or diplomatic coercion, as well as gray zone coercion, which often manifests itself in South and East China Sea disputes that China actually has. So when it comes to sort of the effectiveness of this carrots and sticks strategy, I would say it might be effective in the short term, but sort of the growing use of these coercive measures might be might be ineffective in the long term. But it also demonstrates there is a tension in China's overall goals. So on one hand, China wants to ensure a stable external environment for its economic growth. So there needs to be carrots, i.e. Sort of positive means of statecraft. But on the other hand, China wants to signal resolve to ensure sort of territorial sovereignty and integrity of it, which means that China will need to use coercive actions. And these, I would say, two sets of goals are in tension with one another, which I think inherently limits the effectiveness of China's sort of long-term goals in order to keep them hand in hand, which means that I don't think that this is sort of a sustainable grand strategy in the long term, but at the same time, because the goals that China has in the first place are in tension with one another. So it's really difficult to see the potential effectiveness in the future. And as for Xi's domestic politics, and I think this reflects the tension in China's overall goals, and China, where Xi has been increasing sort of repressive capacity domestically, and including scaling back some of the economic reforms, which I believe might not be conducive to the sustainability of China's overall growth in the future. But at the same time, there might be some indications that Xi is aware of the sort of the issue with scaling back economic reforms, and he's been sort of emphasizing China being open again in more of the recent remarks. So I think remains to be seen whether he's going to be changing the direction or not.
So Hal, how do you think about this second question?
So I think that the goals of China's grand strategy, which we all discussed in one way or another in the first segment, have remained relatively constant over time. It's China's approach to achieving them that has shifted. And so for about 30 years after the beginning of the reform and opening period under Deng Xiaoping, the strategy was essentially one that was commonly characterized as hide your capabilities and bide your time. Basically, don't give other countries, particularly the United States, any pretext to prematurely gang up on China, limit its economic growth, limit its accumulation of economic and other forms of power on the international stage. And I think looking back, we would have to say that that was one of the most successful grand strategies in history. If you look not simply at the trajectory of China's growth from the late 70s to the early 2000s, but the way in which that growth, the way in which the emergence of a really formidable rival was actually assisted and facilitated by the United States and Japan and other countries that had a great deal to lose from that emergence. It's really quite an impressive performance. I think that strategy, however, started to change really around 2008, 2009. It dates back, it predates Xi. It goes back to the financial crisis. There's a debate over whether the financial crisis made China overconfident or made it insecure or some mixture of the two. But since then, and particularly since Xi Jinping announced his striving for achievement motto in 2012, I believe it was, you've seen a China that is much more willing to act coercively, to act abrasively, and to actually incur the hostility of the United States. And that's gone into overdrive in the past year and a half during COVID. And this brings me to the second part of your question. I think Xi Jinping is actually doing grave damage to China's grand strategy in real time. If you look at the way that global views of China have soured over the past 18 months, if you ask the question, is the world more conducive to China's continued rise now than it was 5 years ago or now than it was 10 years ago? I think it gives you a pretty stark picture of how much more concerned the world is about China as a disruptive actor than it once was. And when you add that to the ways in which Xi's political centralization is probably undercutting the prospects for future economic reform, I think the damage could be quite severe.
Yeah. Let me just foot stop your point, Hal, about the change in approach beginning before Xi, because I think a lot of people, when they talk about this, put this fully with Xi, and it really began under Hu Jintao. That's absolutely right. Graham, how do you think about this question?
Well, that's a deep question, because let me just try to be brief. I'd say I largely agree, but somewhat disagree with what's been said. I would say that on the first proposition, Xi puts the home front first. So this is mainly about making China successful. And I actually have a chapter in my book on this called What China Wants. And I noticed, and I describe in detail, 4 revolutions that he's running simultaneously. First, he's validating the party as the vanguard in the leadership of the Chinese people. Second, he's reviving Chinese nationalism and patriotism to make Chinese proud of being Chinese again. Third, he's re-engineering an economic revolution to try to sustain unsustainably high levels of economic growth. And finally, he's rebuilding a military that, in his words, he says, can fight and win. Doing any one of these would be an amazing thing to be trying to do in any society. 4 at one time is huge. He believes he needs to do all of these at the same time. He laid these out very carefully with actually benchmarks, target dates, KPIs, people responsible for them. So this is not simply an abstract strategy. This is a specific plan of action. And you can watch and see what he's doing and see how close it comes to this marker. Internationally, well, I think in terms of his international strategy, it's first make China everything it can be powerfully, economically at home in the first instance. So China today has about 1/4 of the U.S. per capita GDP. He doesn't see any reason why by 2035, and this is his target, should be half the U.S. GDP. And by 2049, the 100th anniversary, it should be equal to the U.S. Well, with 4 times as many people, we don't have to work very hard with the arithmetic to see how big the GDP would be relative to the US, and all the other dimensions of power follow, in his perspective, from that substructure. Secondly, the international component of this is to make China the indispensable economic relationship for every major economy. Today, China is the major trading partner of 130 countries, including all of the big ones. So basically, China's, it's more, as Lee Kuan Yew explained, a geoeconomics rather than the military security emphasis that the U.S. has given in the recent period. I think that's the strategy, and I would say pretty much on course. So in terms of the recent course corrections, I think he and his team think about this as a work in progress with experiments, but the fact that they believe in socialism, maybe even more than Bernie Sanders, shouldn't be surprised. These are socialists. Therefore, they believe in redistribution of income. They believe in knocking down the billionaires and letting the millionaires have a chance. And these are very popular moves. Their anti-corruption campaign has been extremely popular in China. The moves against the billionaires have been extremely popular in China. So have they made some missteps? Yes. Do they risk strangling some of the geese that have been laying the golden eggs? Yes, they do. They're intent on party control of everything, but I would say pretty much steady on course.
Okay, so this brings us to what I think is a very important question, which is, in what ways does this matter to the United States of America, right? And I think when people talk about this, you get a lot of vagueness, and so I'm going to push you guys to be specific, right? Does China reaching its ambitions, does China achieving the world order that it wants to achieve, right? Does that lower our standard of living below what it would otherwise be? Does that put our privacy and civil liberties at risk here any more than they would be without China reaching its ambitions? Is the world a less stable place? In what ways does this really matter to the United States? In what way is this a threat and or challenge? Hal?
So I think this is the central question. And as you indicated, it's also the most elided question in discussions of China. And let's leave aside for a moment the question of the possibility of a war between the United States and China, which is possible and would obviously have directly disruptive effects for the United States. But put that aside for a second. So I think that if you're thinking about the challenge that China poses to the United States, you should think about it geopolitically, economically, and ideologically. And so geopolitically, the United States for about 125 years has said that we have a vital national interest in preventing any other power, particularly a hostile power, particularly an authoritarian power, from dominating a region of the world that we think is essential to our own security and prosperity. And we've typically defined those regions outside the Western Hemisphere as Europe, East Asia, and after 1945, the Middle East. And what we worry about is that if a country, whether it was Japan in the 1930s and early 1940s, or the Soviet Union or China today, came to dominate one of the world's critical regions, it would become so strong that it could potentially coerce other countries on a global scale, and that it would be able to basically displace the United States as the world's leading power, and potentially could develop the wherewithal, even the military wherewithal, to pose a direct threat to the United States. So that's one. Economically, the reason we have worried about this sort of thing in the past, and I think it's valid in thinking about China today, is we were always concerned that if a country that was hostile to us, again, became preeminent in one way or another in a region like East Asia, it would alter that region's terms of trade. Basically, it would turn the economies of the region towards itself and away from the United States in a way that great powers have traditionally done in their spheres of influence. And so we would see a decrement in our own prosperity because we would have less access to the most economically dynamic region of the world. And so that's the economic piece of it. Then I think the ideological or the values piece of it is perhaps the least understood, but it's actually quite important. One of the most worrying things about Chinese conduct, from my perspective, is the way that China has basically tried to export its free speech restrictions to the world. And so when the Australian government asked for an impartial international inquiry into the origins of COVID about a year ago, the Chinese not only slapped economic sanctions on the Australians and said, you have to stop. They said, by the way, you need to shut down these newspapers and these think tanks that publish anti-China material. Basically, you must neuter your own civil society if you want to maintain good relations with China. This is a part of a larger pattern where when actors in Norway or in Lithuania or whatever the country may be criticize Chinese foreign policy or Chinese domestic practices in particular, China will use economic sanctions to basically try to penalize that sort of speech. This would have a profoundly corrosive impact on the quality of democratic societies worldwide if China were able to do this successfully on a regular basis. And so I think that's the third, but in some ways the most important challenge that it poses.
Yeah. Graham, comments?
Well, I like what Hal said, but I'd say this is a very, very Michael Morell question. I remember you asking questions like this in government, and I've thought hard about this question even before you pressed it, and I've yet to find an answer that I can read that I find satisfactory. So that's an uncomfortable conclusion, but of course, it's very disruptive for the U.S. to have China displacing us as the manufacturing workshop of the world, or as the major trading partner of everybody, or as the leader of 5G. I mean, as an American, I hate this. I think we should win the gold medals in every Olympic race. Okay, and the idea that there's now this rival that actually has overtaken us in many, and it's giving us a run for our money in others, I find it stressful. I think the question, though, is if America's vital national interest, if we go back to the Cold War and to the mantra that we all said over and over, is to, quote, to ensure the survival of the U.S. as a free nation with our fundamental institutions and values intact, then is the China we're seeing with its current ambitions in the foreseeable future a serious threat to that? I think the answer is not clear. So Lee Kuan Yew imagined that it might be possible for the US and China to, quote, share the Pacific in the 21st century. Well, what would be the terms of that sharing? So when I think about it, I think, well, okay, if China became as predominant in Western Asia as the US is in our hemisphere, or was in the 20th century in the Western hemisphere, well, so what? Okay, so how does this likely impact the terms of the economic development and trade? How severe would the tilt in the balance that Hal talked about be? I would think then, secondly, well, what would happen to the Asian balance of power between China, Japan, India, Australia, South Korea? Would this end up being a stable or unstable? And if unstable, war? And if so, how would it impact us? What would happen to the nuclear order if US were withdrawing, in effect, from west of the, Hawaii or something? Does Japan become a nuclear weapon state? I think probably, or South Korea, probably. And then, well, we thought the world would come to an end when India and Pakistan became nuclear weapon states. It didn't, but nonetheless, if you imagine some version. So I have more questions here than answers. And I think that I haven't seen anybody write down for debate as a clear account of why this impacts American vital national interests.
Ketian.
So I actually agree with Graham here and might sort of disagree with Hal a little bit in the sense that I agree with Hal that China and the United States, or China poses threats to the United States in terms of economic competition, human rights issues, as well as U.S. hegemony or status in the Asia Pacific. But at the same time, I think the threats are not as significant as some of the media sort of made it out to be. First, because I don't think that China poses a significant ideological threat to the United States in the sense that at least studies have shown, especially by China scholars, Jessica Weiss, for example, that China has not intended to export authoritarian models to or across the world, even though domestically China is an authoritarian and repressive state. And China is not a communist country either, if we're really talking about communism as an ideology. And I think it's more of a single party authoritarian state that wants to develop its economy. So Yashen Huang, for example, at MIT, really coined China's development model as a capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So I don't think there's too much of an ideological threat or component here. And despite that there is economic competition between China and the United States, there's also, I would say, a high degree of economic interdependence that China benefits from. In other words, if China wants to develop its economy continuously in the future, I don't think it can survive without the supply and production chain. So even if we're talking about Huawei and Huawei's development, Huawei still needs Taiwan, South Korea, for example, for critical parts of this component, especially the semiconductor industry, for example, and I don't think that China can really survive or develop its economy without this sort of supply and production chain globally, which the United States and its allies in the region are a part of. I think that sort of acts as a restraining factor and reduces the level of threat that China poses to the United States at the economic level.
This is the first disagreement we've had, which is fantastic. I have to tell you that I asked the question because I'm intellectually sort of where Graham is. I really have a hard time answering the question, and I haven't seen anybody provide a answer that's satisfactory to me. But I have to say that Hal's answer tonight was compelling. So with this first disagreement, I'm going to give Hal the last word on this.
So let me continue the theme of disagreement and pick up on the point about ideological challenges. And with all respect to scholars who've written on this issue and come out with a different place, I think it's just manifestly evident that while China may not be sort of a messianic communist regime, and I don't know any serious commentators who make that argument, many of the things it does have the effect of strengthening autocratic regimes in the world. And so when China runs interference at the United Nations for countries that are committing human rights abuses at home, when it exports surveillance equipment to autocratic regimes in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America or a variety of other places, when it basically tries to establish the norm that what a country does to its own citizens is none of the business of the rest of the world, that is something that has a direct, tangible impact on the balance of democracy and authoritarianism worldwide. We can debate what the causes of that behavior are, whether the Chinese Communist Party just thinks that selling smart city technology to kleptocrats is good business, or whether it thinks that there is an ideological or a geopolitical component to it. But what's really important is that China's actions have this impact on the international stage. And we can argue about how much of a direct threat that poses to America. I'll simply say that it has been a guiding principle of American statecraft dating back to World War I, if not before, that American democracy and American security will be in a better place in a world where democracy is not universal, but is relatively strong relative to ideological competitors. And so if you buy that argument, then there is some degree of challenge that Chinese behavior poses in this ideological realm as well.
Okay, so our fourth question, which is not about China, it's about the United States response to everything we've just talked about. So does the United States have a strategy for dealing with China's ambitions in the world? If so, what is it? If so, what do you think of it as a strategy? If we don't, why don't we have one? Is our approach to China driven more by politics than by our own domestic politics, rather than by a rigorous assessment of our national interests? How do you think about how the U.S. is coming at this? Ketian.
So obviously I'm not an actual expert on U.S. foreign policy or grand strategy, but I'll just pretend to be one here. And I think the United States has been sort of practicing for a long time a combination of engagement and containment, right? Especially through engagement through economic realm and more so containment in, for example, the military realm. I think the strategy itself, at least from my perspective, does not have an issue per se, but sometimes it's really more of the implementation of the strategy and the domestic politics behind the implementation of the strategy that can make the signals being sent to China being ambiguous. And I think what I mean by that is that at times domestic politics in the US, and I would say in China as well, made it difficult for, I think, both sides to be honest and transparent about their intentions, and sometimes gets in the way of direct channels of communication or the further institutionalizations of direct channel or direct talks, etc. I think the more recent Xi-Biden, for example, meeting is kind of at least good indicator of the high levels of direct channels of communication, but it's hard to see where this might go based off of the current sort of climate, political climate here in DC as well as in Beijing, which sometimes makes it much more difficult to set clear red lines as well as to send reassuring signals to avoid, say, conflicts or escalation. And the other issue I want to point out would be sort of I think a long existing gap between academia and the policy community, especially with the policy community not sometimes relying on the academia, especially regional experts. I think the Biden administration is doing a much better job now, but I think there are still a lot of a gap in this regard, which might reduce our understanding about, for example, the peer competitor that is China.
Graham.
Oh, a big question. So I think, no, we don't have a strategy. I think mainly what's happening is a kind of a rolling wake up to the realities of the China challenge. This became more intense under the Trump administration, which I think had more of an, would say an attitude than a strategy, had some slogans about compete and confront, but not necessarily to what end or how. And I think the Biden administration, at least so far, is being dragged around by the politics in which the fever about China is increasingly rising on a bipartisan basis in the Washington crowd, both across the political spectrum and in lots of the blob, as it's been trying to formulate a strategy for dealing with China. I think so far it's beginning to recognize the challenge. And then Biden would say the strategy consists of three elements. First, the home front first. So unless you can rebuild American confidence, you can overcome what, as he likes to say, Lincoln's line about a house divided against itself can't stand. So unless we can reunify the country, and unless we can restore our competitiveness, then we lose. Secondly, to rebuild relationships with allies, because recognizing that the fundamental tectonics of power have been shifting dramatically as China has risen, means that unless we get some, I've just compared it with the so-called seesaw of power, unless we get some more allies with weight on our side of the seesaw, we'll have both feet off the ground. And then finally, I think what they expect is that if one could build or create enough of a level playing field or a correlation of forces that required China to compete fairly, that over time in a longer run competition, they believe, and I believe, that a liberty-based democracy will more successfully deliver what citizens want than a party-led autocracy. So the longer-term picture of this would be a competition between the U.S. and China with guardrails on a relatively level playing field, ensured by a correlation of forces or balance of power that meant that China would have to essentially play by the rules. Whether they're going to get there with a strategy, particularly since the country is, we don't need to explain to this group, so deeply divided, and politics is so deeply divided, and in this area, they've been following the politics more than the strategy.
Hal?
I'm afraid we're back to a love fest in the sense that I think that Graham and Ketian described it quite nicely. I think Trump had a theme of competition, which was an overdue corrective, but had wildly inconsistent policies on everything from, did the president want to treat China as a strategic competitor, or did he just want a really good trade deal with China that would actually deepen American economic integration with Beijing? To questions of human rights, to the issue of, we were going to start this fight with China, but at the same time, we were going to start fights with many of our democratic allies as well. I think what the Biden administration has tried to do is basically adopt the frame of competition while pursuing it in what they would see as sort of a more sophisticated, more multilateral way, sort of rounding up the posse of allies and partners, as Graham might have put it, to bring greater leverage to bear in dealing with China. I think that in many ways, what the Biden administration describes its strategy as being makes a lot of sense. That said, I think there are still some pretty big question marks that are sufficient that we would not say the administration has a fully fleshed out strategy. There is nothing resembling an economic component of the strategy, particularly when it comes to trade and making the United States a factor in the trade relations of the Asia Pacific in this century. There really hasn't been a whole lot of clarity with respect to what this strategy is ultimately meant to produce or achieve. Is it meant to produce some sort of stable coexistence between the United States and China? Is it meant to produce some grand bargain? Is it meant to produce something else? I think that question has yet to be answered. And I think we're also sort of struggling to answer the question of, on what timeline do we think the China challenge will become most severe? I think everybody assumes this is going to get worse before it gets better. But are we thinking about this as a 2025 problem when we might have to face a Taiwan crisis that forces the US president to make some really tough decisions about the use of force? Is it a 2035 problem, a 2045 problem, and so on and so forth? Because that has huge implications for the military investments you make and just generally how you think about your China strategy.
Which is a great transition to the last question, which is, where does all this leave us, right? What does the future look like? Is it a new Cold War, right? That looks quite different from the old Cold War, but still a Cold War. Is there a real risk of a hot war? Is the future going to look like something else? How do you all think about that? Hal, let's start with you.
So I think it's not the Cold War, but it is a Cold War. And so obviously the differences between the US-Soviet contest and the US-China competition are significant. And I don't think they require a lot of elaboration. Economically, geographically, ideologically, the relationship is just different than it was during the Cold War. And I think that sophisticated observers understand that. That said, I think that the US-China competition is one of a number of great power competitions going back hundreds or even thousands of years. It is going to be a contest that involves all forms of national power. It is going to be conducted under the shadow of military power and under the threat, or at least the danger of war in certain scenarios. And I think that qualifies as a Cold War, if not the Cold War. But what I really worry about is not the Cold War scenario. I think that's actually kind of the best case scenario at the moment. It's the hot war scenario. And tensions have obviously ratcheted up considerably in the Taiwan Strait over the past couple of years. You had senior US military officials say that they think China could try to forcibly unify with Taiwan by 2025 or 2027, depending on who is doing the talking. There are a variety of other scenarios that a co-author, Mike Beckley, and I described in a recent piece about how you could plausibly get conflict in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or even in places like along the Himalayan border with India. And so I think what we have to remember is that, at the beginning of the Cold War, nobody made a principled decision that this was going to be a Cold War for the next 45 years, and both sides would abstain from using force against each other. That was something that worked itself out through a pattern of deterrence and crisis and hard work. And I think we should assume that to keep the US-China competition cold, it's going to require all of that again, in addition to some of the hard diplomatic work of trying to ease tensions where it's possible and where that's consistent with American interests.
Graham?
Well, I think I agree. So I think I thought the piece that Hal and Gaddis wrote, reminding us that this is not the Cold War. And actually, I argue a lot with people about this, that the analogy, since people capture the Cold War, misleads more than it clarifies. On the other hand, as they say in the piece, if all we mean by Cold War is not hot, but a protracted conflict, then of course there's many Cold Wars going on at the same time. Do we have a quote Cold War with Iran or Cold War with North Korea, or does Israel? So I think that if we're just talking about a protracted conflict, will this be a protracted conflict on all dimensions? And we hope not the dimension of hot, which would be bombs and bullets with uniformed combatants. I think that'll be the challenge. I think that's the problem. Now, what then could it be? I think the picture of a long-term competition in which a liberty-based democracy seeks to show that it can work better for people and for what human beings want than a party-led autocracy is a race I'm perfectly happy to run. I think I hear in some part of the American conversation now, people who've either become to despair about the US or are defeatist, who fear such a race. I would say if we could have a balance of power or correlation of forces that provided a level enough playing field to let the parties continue to show what they can do, I bet over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we'll have to work hard to prevent it becoming hot, but I would run that race. And I would say that's a pretty good vision of a future in which then, if we fail, well, we fail. But if China continues to, I think that the basic proposition, it's a naive Western proposition perhaps, but I think it is my conviction and yours that in every heart, in every breast is a heart beating to be free. So human beings will want freedom if and as they have other things. So I think that's the picture I would look for. And I think trying to manage it, I think as Hal said, a version of a protracted conflict that does not turn hot, but in which the systems have a chance to show how well they can work. If we manage that for another 30 or 40 years, I think that would be a good outcome.
Ketian, you get the last word here.
Sure. I'll try to be brief. And I think I might sort of term the future as more of a either a competition or a cold peace, as opposed to more of a Cold War, because it's more on the optimistic side in the sense that there are, I think, restraining factors that reduce the potential for a conflict. Of course, Taiwan is a scenario that is probably the most important scenario, which the United States and China might be directed into a conflict. But I think barring that, there are a lot of other factors that can reduce the potential of conflict. And the first one is that I think there are a lot of common interests that the United States and China share, despite the many conflictual and probably irreconcilable conflicts of interest, right, regarding sovereignty or freedom, human rights, etc. But if we're talking about climate change or non-traditional security and those kind of themes, which Xi and Biden actually talked about in their virtual meeting last Monday, and I think that there is a ground for cooperation between the two sides. And secondly, I think even on the economic front, China and the United States, I think it's really difficult for China to thrive without the United States, or as I've mentioned earlier, the supply and production chain. So I think even in the economic realm, there are things that the United States, for example, can do to, I would say, restrain China. And there are studies done, I think, by scholars that sort of characterize the U.S. leverage as weaponized interdependence. That is, the United States can use financial leverage over China to potentially coerce China in national security aspects. And I think finally, although we know or observe a lot of coercive behavior that China has been, I think, engaging in the past, say, 3 decades or so. But I wanted to sort of scale it back in the sense that China is a cautious bully, and it has always been making a Goldilocks kind of choice in the sense that because it is concerned about military escalation into a conflict with the United States, it tends to use coercion that is a little bit more gray zone or has a little bit more plausible deniability. And because of this Goldilocks choice, and I think we tend to, it might have an effect of reducing the potential for a major escalation, although we might be seeing skirmishes and sort of lower level conflicts or sort of gray zone skirmishes in maritime disputes or even in the land border disputes. But I don't think China intentionally it's out there to start a conflict. And maybe just very last and finally, I think it's really important to remember that China is an authoritarian state. And because of that, it has a lot of internal and domestic issues that it has to care about. And I think that derives, or I think that really takes up a lot of the attention of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think at the end of the day, China's ambition might be grand, but its resources are finite. And I think its sanctionist capability might not be as large as I think some of us might believe it to be.
So thank you all for amazing, terrific thoughts on some really difficult questions. We're gonna turn to audience questions for the next 15 minutes or so. I'm gonna throw the question out and just have one of the three of you, grab it, and then we'll move to the next question. And the first question, and I'm putting 2 or 3 questions together here, is how do you think about the relationship between Beijing and Moscow in terms of Chinese ambitions in the world, in terms of the Chinese using its relationship with Russia to that end? Is there a play there for the United States that folks haven't thought about in the way we did, perhaps during the Cold War in reverse? Who wants to grab that?
I wrote a piece on this, Michael, in 2018, I think, in the National Interest, basically taking Spig Brzezinski's insight called the Alliance of the Aggrieved. So most Americans don't appreciate it, but the relationship between China and Russia is tighter, is more effective operationally than the U.S. relationship with India, for example. And even if you try to take criteria for comparing alliances and alignments, it's not a formal alliance, but if you look at the various features of it, it has almost all those features. Does Xi, who are the 2 closest leaders to each other? Xi and Putin. Who's the first person Xi went to visit when he became president? Putin. Who pops up at every Xi meeting first after Xi? Putin. Do they compare threats? Yes. When they talk to each other, they talk about the Americans in particular, attempting to undermine our governments. That means them, these autocrats. They talk about the methods in which they do it. They talk about the methods in which they will combat it. Do their militaries compare threats? Yes, they do. So I think this is a functionally, increasingly a tight relationship. And I think, unfortunately, U.S. policy, both in the previous administration and this administration, is doing everything possible to assist Xi in building this relationship. So I think it's even to the point where if I were watching and worried about something happening in Taiwan, I would be watching extremely closely what might be happening in Ukraine or what might be happening in the Baltics or vice versa. So I would say that this is a tight operational relationship and it's getting increasingly tighter. And what Spig's point, that this is just a year before he died, about the alignment was the aggrieved, was that American policy, if it makes 2 adversaries here, will basically allow them to reverse what was the brilliance in Henry's trilateral diplomacy, in which we became closer to each of the parties than they were to the other. In the trilateral arrangement, you would like to be the party that's got the tightest relationship with the 2 rather than the 1.
Here's a great question. We hear a lot about an American commitment to Taiwan, but at the end of the day, what are our realistic options from defending Taiwan from a Chinese attack and Chinese invasion, however you would see that playing out?
I'm happy to take a crack at this one. I think the bad news is that if China mounts a full-scale attack on Taiwan, it would be an extremely difficult operation for the United States to undertake to blunt that invasion and to stop Taiwan. I think we should assume that a Chinese assault on Taiwan would be accompanied by missile attacks on American bases in the Western Pacific, Guam and Okinawa in particular, in an effort to basically cripple American naval and air power in the region and buy time for Beijing to establish a lodgment on Taiwan. And frankly, it would be difficult for the United States to surge enough combat power into the Western Pacific quickly enough to make a difference. So that's the bad news. The good news, I think, is twofold. One is that when we think about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, we shouldn't think about something on the scale of the Allied invasion of Normandy in World War II. We should think about something that's actually considerably bigger and more difficult than that. The stretch of water that has to be crossed, the complexity of the terrain that has to be subdued, the number of troops that would be involved, all of this would make this probably the most significant amphibious undertaking, the most significant amphibious assault in history, in recorded history. And amphibious assaults are some of the most difficult operations to pull off in the military sphere. And so that's one piece of good news. It would be difficult for us to respond, be very difficult for China to do it. The second is that the United States and Taiwan could actually make it a heck of a lot harder for China to succeed by doing some relatively simple things. We don't need super advanced next generation capabilities to blunt a Chinese assault on Taiwan. We need lots of long-range munitions, lots of anti-ship missiles, lots of sea mines, basically lots of things that can turn a Chinese invasion fleet into a bloody mess as it comes across the strait. And actually those things they're available now. They're relatively cheap. We just need more of them. And so I think the major problem that the U.S. military has right now, and the Taiwanese military as well, is that we actually know what we need to be doing to give ourselves credible defense options in a Taiwan contingency. We're just not doing them fast enough.
And also, Hal, it doesn't sound like we're actually selling Taiwan what you just said they need.
Well, the Taiwanese, they don't always want to buy what they need, frankly, right? And they want to buy some, you can derisively call them prestige capabilities, so expensive fighter jets and ships and things like that. The Taiwanese have their reasons, right? Because they assume that they will never be able to defend themselves by themselves. And so they don't want to create the impression that that's what they're going to be able to do. They basically know that they just have to buy time for somebody being us, to come rescue them, or it's a hopeless cause in the first place. But yes, this has been a real challenge. And so significant parts of the Taiwanese military budget still go to capabilities that just won't be that useful in Taiwan contingency. There is a piece of, there's some relatively constructive legislation on the Hill that is meant to address this right now. And we could talk about that in further detail if people are interested. But I think we at least know what the problem is, and there are smart people who are thinking about ways of solving it.
Yeah. Let me, Michael, if I could just make a footnote.
Sure.
To give a shout out for a very good article by Michael Morell and Sandy Winnefeld in the Naval Proceedings on this issue, where I think you answer the question quite clearly about the capabilities today, which are so inadequate that a Chinese effort to take Taiwan, if there were a provocation in Taiwan to which she reacted by using military force to prevent Taiwan becoming independent, it would likely succeed before we would arrive, just as Al was mentioning. And you all stretch it out to 2025 or 2030 to imagine what we could buy and what they could buy and build in the period between then that could change the terms, or at least extend for some considerable period of time what would be required for China to succeed, and also increase the costs significantly and raise the uncertainties. Unfortunately, the list of items that they could buy, or we could sell them, or we could do, has pretty much been the same, if I remember, and I think you'll point this out in the article, for the past decade and maybe even for 2 decades. So there's some substantial obstacles to, it's easy to say what might be possible to do. There's been some reasons why that hasn't happened, and then that's a long conversation.
Yeah. And I remember that mines were very high on Sandy's
Exactly.
list. Yeah, Ketian, I think this is one right down your alley. So somebody is pointing out here that East Asia is not monolithic, right? There are very powerful and wealthy countries like Japan and South Korea, and there are less wealthy, less powerful countries throughout the region. Is China's approach to those different? And in particular, how do they think about coercing Japan and South Korea and bringing them under the wing that both Graham and Hal talked about, right? This East Asian sphere of influence that they're interested in. How do they think about the big, powerful countries?
Mm-hmm. Well, so first off, I don't think China is naive enough to believe that it'll be able to bring Japan and South Korea to sort of severe influence through sort of use of coercive power. But sort of to answer your question, China has been using, I would say, sort of a cautious coercive approach to both smaller countries in the region as well as larger powers such as South Korea and Japan, because of the power of I think economic interdependence. So in Japan, for example, China has been using more of a gray zone coercion, using the Coast Guard ships, etc., because China has less of an economic leverage vis-a-vis Japan, and it still needs a lot in terms of intermediate products from Japan. But with regard to South Korea, China has been using, for example, canceling the concerts by Korean pop stars or music teams in China. So this is kind of was a reaction to the U.S. deployment of that. So even with larger powers, China does and has been using these sort of coercive actions, but it's still a Goldilocks choice because of the concerns about escalation. It tends to stay at a very targeted and smart or small aspect. But I also wanted to emphasize that China does not only use coercive measures, it tends to pair coercive measures with carrots, i.e. providing economic incentives to other countries surrounding the target state so as to show or have a demonstration effect to the target state that if you sort of listen or conform to the things that the Chinese government demands you to do, then you'll be able to get those kind of economic goodies as well.
Yeah. Hypersonics. Question on hypersonics. Question on the recent Chinese test that the chairman, I think, called a near Sputnik moment. How do you think about that from a nuclear war perspective? Is this damaging to mutually assured destruction is the specific question. And then I would tack on to that, how do we think about confronting Chinese hypersonics, across the board?
Maybe I'll take a quick stab at this one and just say that I think that from what we've read about it in the press, at least, the capability that was demonstrated back in August may in itself be less significant than what it sort of represents symbolically. And so, hypersonic missiles can be useful in certain situations. And so you might use them, for instance, if you were trying to paralyze the other side's command and control early in a conflict to gain some sort of tactical advantage, they might be useful for that. And so it's not that there's no military utility in this sort of capability. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think the reason it's significant, though, is that the Chinese attainment of the capability appears to have come significantly sooner than our military and intel folks were expecting. And so that naturally raises the question, what other Chinese capabilities are we underestimating? Where might be the next place that we are surprised? And so if it seems like the reaction to the August test is a bit out of proportion, I think it has more to do with kind of that larger salience than it does with the specific capability itself.
Let me just pile on, and I agree with Hal. I think the emphasis was on the shock about the speed of the advance of the hypersonic program, but We've just completed a study as part of our China working group here at Harvard on the military rivalry between the U.S. and China, looking across the spectrum of capabilities. And I would say pretty much the story is the same across the whole spectrum. The advance of the Chinese military capabilities over the last 20 years, from where 20 years ago you could hardly find them in the rearview mirror, to the place where they're now roughly equal or sometimes ahead in some particular arenas, is really quite striking. And I think that's what's ultimately sinking in here. I think on the second point, though, there's also in the press in particular a temptation to hype every new story about China and exaggerate in ways that ultimately, I think, mislead, because the reality is that China has become a serious peer competitor in many military arenas. The nuclear arena in particular is not one. So China has about 300 warheads. We have about whatever, 4,000 or 5,000. If China moves from 300 to 1,000 warheads over a decade, this is going to make some substantial difference in terms of any scenario that you and I ever planned for. I haven't been able to find one. So is this a bad idea? Yes. Why might they be doing it? Well, there's another long discussion. But is that a threat, as the FT had a version of it? This is the threat to Taiwan today. No, there are plenty of threats to Taiwan today. They're not Chinese nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Ketian, do you want to say something?
Sure, just very real quick, and I agree with Graham here in the sense that I think China's sort of development of this weapon is really in reaction to the U.S. national missile defense system. So it's really to ensure China secures second strike capability as opposed to moving it into a first strike kind of force, kind of a posture. And I think Fiona Cunningham and Cheryl Fribble has a really good article out in the Washington Post, detailing China's rationale and why did China do what it did in the nuclear realm.
Okay, so I want to use the moderator's prerogative here to ask the final question. So it's a Michael question. And what I'm wondering is, how do you think the Chinese see us? Do you think that they understand our current capabilities? Whether we're talking military, economic, diplomatic, do you think they understate them, overstate them? Do you think they understand them where they are? Who wants to grab that?
Before the COVID shutdown, I was in China about every other month for the previous 2 years, because they've been very interested in the Thucydides trap book. And the idea of this guy they had hardly heard of, who was a contemporary of Confucius, and he had a pattern in history. So that appeals very much to Chinese mentality. I got a chance to become fairly friendly with a half dozen people that work directly for Xi, including their vice president, Wang Qishan, who was a historian before his current job. So I think they are extremely puzzled by the U.S. They can't quite believe that it is as disorganized and disorderly as it appears to them. So they read what Americans' most severe critics say about ourselves, that the country is in deep trouble, that we're fundamentally split, that we have an election in which we're not quite sure about the transfer of power, that we had a constitutional crisis, that people are teaching in schools that America is an evil country, not a good country, that blah, blah, blah. So they go on down the list of such things, and they think, well, our grand narrative says not only are we rising, but they are in irreversibly declining. I guess that's what we're seeing. And then on the other hand, other people say, but wait a minute, look at this feature of America, look at that feature of America, look at another. So I think they're quite confused about what the ultimate trajectory will be. I know for sure that Xi Jinping is worried about what because he talked to Lee Kuan Yew a lot about this, and Lee Kuan Yew explained it to me in some detail. He asked him, how do the Americans have this, they call it a black box, he said, that allows them, after having reached the point of collapse and catastrophe, to reinvent themselves. That's the story of American history, she said to Lee Kuan Yew, that here in the Revolutionary War, they almost lost, but then somehow they won. In the Civil War, the country almost fell apart, but then it recovered. In the Great Depression, the country was collapsing, but then it recovered. So how do they manage to do this? And Lee Kuan Yew told him, this is a great puzzle. I don't know the answer, but he was extremely interested in it. So I think they're confused about the way some Americans are about, in our good days and our bad days.
Ketian, Hal, do you guys want to add?
Sure. So I think that first off, I don't think that there is a single sort of a Chinese narrative about its perception about the United States, in the sense that despite China being an authoritarian country, there is not the Chinese when it comes to observing the United States. So I would say in public, you rarely would see, if you interview a person that says that America is so great, China is not as good as America, etc. But in private, I would say, including the elites as well as the public, they actually have a relatively accurate assessment of U.S. capability, especially in the economic and technological realm, such that they don't think that China is anywhere soon that will be passing the United States. And I think China is not, or at least in the private assessment, China is not overly confident. And even in some of the publicly available government analyses in more recent years, I don't think there is a tone of overconfidence in terms of China's capability. And I think China has always been, or at least these government analysts have always been, relatively accurately assessing U.S. capability and resolve to a certain extent. But it's really the domestic politics in China that got in the way, which by that I mean it's really difficult for anyone to say something different to Xi or to voice opinions that are more, say, liberal or moderate, and it's just not domestically or politically viable for these voices to be heard. But I don't think that there is the Chinese perception that is overly confident and underestimating U.S. capability.
Hal?
So I think one of the scariest things right now is that actually, senior members of the U.S. government have publicly been very candid in saying we just don't know what Xi Jinping thinks, and frankly, we don't know who talks to him. What we know is that the people who talk to us are not the people who are influential with him, and we don't know whether there are people around Xi Jinping who are willing to give him honest advice when that advice involves bearing bad news. And in fact, there may be some reason to suggest that that's not the case. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing with wolf warrior diplomacy, I suspect, is basically Chinese diplomats performing or thinking that they're performing based on what Xi Jinping wants and based on the tone that he has asked them to set. The reason I think that that's worrying is there's actually a long history of authoritarian leaders underestimating the United States for just the reasons that Graham talked about, thinking that this country is sort of constantly on the verge of falling apart, will never be able to keep up with sort of more disciplined authoritarian systems. And there is a danger, frankly, that people in authoritarian systems can come to believe that propaganda over time, and it can lead them to be overconfident and to take risks that a more sober assessment might caution them against taking. And so if I have sort of a significant fear about the U.S.-China relationship today, it's there could be a sense of Chinese overconfidence in a near-term sense, not necessarily in a long-term sense, that comes from these factors.
Thank you guys very much. It's been a fascinating discussion. Larry.
Yeah, let me jump in and thank you all as well. This has been a master class in just American national security, foreign relations. The expertise you all brought to our audience has been phenomenal. As with everything, there's not obviously an easy solution. I hope you all are together or individually talking to the folks in Washington who are having to make the hard decisions. But General Hayden, did you have any final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you. This is a lot going on. Maybe you can do it again, maybe. I would like that a lot, a very lot. In the meantime, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
Thank you
Thanksgiving.
again.
And so everyone have a happy Thanksgiving. Do join us after Thanksgiving. We've got an event coming up next Wednesday where we're going to look at COVID and intelligence. Where do we go from here? We're going to have Representative Eric Swalwell, who has been promoting a lot of potential reforms of the intel community in support of issues of biosecurity, pandemic, and public health. We're going to have Dr. Julie Gerberding, who is a former director of the CDC. And we're going to have Mr. Matt Barrett, who is a former assistant director and leader of a global issue mission center at CIA, to talk over those issues. Moderating will be David Priest from Lawfare. So please do join us. Look for the registration page on our social media. We'll be getting that information out tonight. So thank you very much, Mark.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great Thanksgiving. Hope to see you again soon. Take care.